Hey, it's Ron, and I want to tell you a story about business and how that story changed everything. About 15 years ago, I was standing on a friend's deck in Myrtle Beach. His place sat right on the sand, the kind of spot where the ocean is close enough that you can hear the waves arguing with each other. That afternoon, a hurricane was supposed to be moving through. At least that was the headline. In reality, it felt more like an irritated thunderstorm that lost its confidence on the way in. We were grilling, drinking beers, and trying to decide if we even needed to move the chairs inside. About 100 yards down the beach, the Weather Channel crew was doing a live report. Parkas zipped to their chin, hoods pulled tight, microphones wrapped in plastic, the whole performance. Same beach, same moment, completely different story. And that is when it finally clicked for me. Weather is not just weather. Weather is content. Content is attention, and attention, when handled the right way, turns into revenue. Now, that idea did not start with cable news. It didn't start with satellite imagery or social media or the need to fill 24 hours of programming. The moment weather became a story worth selling goes back much farther, to a place that had nothing to do with oceans or cameras or television crews. It happened on a freezing morning in Montana, when a single report caught someone's attention and refused to let go. So how does a routine weather reading in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map turn into a product the entire country pays attention to? Why would one report on a bitter Montana morning change the way information gets packaged, sold, and amplified? And on January 28, 1887, how did the business of weather begin its shift from simple measurement to marketable story? From Business Basics, I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the daily podcast where we explain the stories that changed business forever. Every date of the year has a story where business reshaped the world. Today, January 28th, that story takes us to 1887, when weather became a story. Fort Keogh was not the kind of place where history usually announced itself. It was a military outpost in eastern Montana, built to monitor the frontier and manage the steady flow of ranchers and freight and telegraph messages moving through the region. The work was practical, the weather logs were more practical. Twice a day, a clerk or a telegraph operator would step outside, measure the temperature, record snow depth, note the conditions, and file it all away. Most of it never traveled farther than the desk where it was written. But in the winter of 1887, Montana was buried under cold. Not surprising, it was the high plains. Snow came thick, hard, and often sideways. What did surprise people were the shapes that formed when the air was just right. Large, wet snowflakes that held together longer than they should. So when a rancher wandered into the post one morning claiming he'd seen a snowflake nearly the width of his hand, no one reacted. When he insisted it was closer to the width of his hat, they laughed. When he said it was nearly 15 inches across, they told him to go warm up by the stove. Still, weather logs had their own rules. You recorded what you heard. You recorded what you saw. You recorded what someone else reported as long as you made it clear it was a report. That was the job. So the operator noted it in the margin. Unusually large flakes reported, possibly 15 inches. He didn't believe it. He didn't need to believe it. He just needed to transmit it. Most telegraph messages disappeared into the silence of the wires. But this one didn't. Something about it, the size, the oddity, the simplicity, caught attention on the other end. A clerk in Miles City repeated it. A weather observer in Bismarck forwarded it. A newspaper editor in St. Paul added a sentence. And then the story took on a shape of its own. And before long, it was more than a detail in a weather log. It was a piece of news. Once the story left the fort, it traveled the way early content always traveled, through repetition. A local paper mentioned it in a short paragraph. Another paper, 200 miles away, expanded the claim for its readers. Within a week, editors across several states were running versions of the same line. Montana reports enormous snowflakes, one wrote. Largest ever recorded, another added. Each retelling stretched the story just a bit further, the way human interest stories can sometimes do. For the telegraph operator, this was the surprise. Messages came back asking for confirmation. Was the measurement real? Could they get a sketch? Could someone vouch for the rancher? He had no answers. He hadn't even seen the thing. But the request itself told him something important. People were not reading this as a weather report. They were reading it as entertainment. And that was the beginning of a pattern that would eventually become a business model. Newspapers needed filler between politics and prices and rail schedules, and odd weather was perfect for that. Almanacs loved extremes. Early science magazines used curiosities to bring in readers. Tourism boosters pointed to Montana as a place full of wonders. The story did not need to be proven. It just needed to be interesting enough to pass along. And it was. The snowflake became a conversation piece, and then a headline, then a fact of record. By the time it entered the meteorological archives, its accuracy mattered far less than its reach. The story had migrated from a cold morning in Montana to a permanent place in the culture. For the operator, it was simple. He had logged a note, he had sent it, and the public had done the rest.
Obtén tu diploma de secundaria por ti y por tu familia. Visita completatudiploma.org para encontrar centros educativos gratuitos cerca de ti. Presentado por Dollar General Literacy Foundation y The Ad Council.
In the years that followed, the Montana snowflake took on a life that had nothing to do with the weather that morning. Newspapers kept reprinting it. Almanacs held on to it. Ripley's, believe it or not, eventually parked it next to other curiosities. Guinness adopted it later, turning a once offhand note into a permanent record. The story became less about snowfall and more about fascination. And fascination, once it gains momentum, tends to create opportunity. Editors learned that weather sells. Not the science, not the measurements, but the stories. The strange, the extreme, the barely believable. It brought readers in, filled blank columns, and gave paper something to publish when the news cycle ran dry. Farmers wanted almanacs with weather lore. Travelers wanted a sense of the frontier's drama. Radio hosts later used odd weather notes as light segments. Television eventually turned storms into full programming blocks. The business of weather didn't begin with satellites. It began with stories like this, moments when the public realized weather could be more than a report, it could be content. Which brings us to the obvious question. Was the snowflake really 15 inches across? Probably not. There is no photo, no preserved sample, no instrument reading, just a few people saying the same thing the same way. But accuracy was never the point. The value was in the attention it generated, the retellings it inspired, and the way it showed a simple truth about human behavior. People share stories that make them pause. And that shift, from weather as a set of measurements to weather as a source of entertainment and commerce, can trace back to January 28, 1887, the day a reported giant snowflake in Montana captured the country's imagination. I'm Ron Trucks, and this is Business History, the podcast that finds the turning points behind the headlines. To hear more stories like this, follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen. And if you're enjoying the stories, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a quick review. It helps more people find the story behind the business. And if you want to actually understand business without the fluff or the buzzwords or the MBA language, start by visiting businessdailypodcast.com.
We all crave something new. At Hertz, new is what we're all about. New adventures, new experiences. When you book with us, you'll be cruising in our newest fleet yet. New features, new tech, and of course, that new car smell. All that wonderful newness, all with no strings attached. So go on, book your new car fling at Hertz.com. Your old car at home never has to know.